All right. And now I would love to introduce you to our presenters. Michael W. Smith is a professor in Temple University's College of Education. He's joined the ranks of college teachers after 11 years of teaching high school English. His research focuses on understanding both how adolescents and adults engage with texts outside school and how teachers can use those understandings to devise more motivating and effective instruction inside schools. A classroom teacher for 15 years, Jeffrey D. Wilhelm is currently a professor of English education at Boise State University. He works in local schools as part of a virtual professional development site network sponsored by the Boise State Writing Project, and he regularly teaches middle and high school students. Jeff is the founding director of the Maine Writing Project and the Boise State Writing Project. Thank you both for being here with us tonight. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
So let's get started. We're going to be talking to you today about our book, Fighting Fake News, that we wrote with our friends, Deborah Appelman and Hugh Kesson. And the reason that we're doing that, next slide, please, is what the stakes of the game. So all of us have been English teachers for a long time, but each of us came to the project with something that caused an awareness that we have to do more to address specifically the issue of fake news and the proliferation of fake news. Federal Judge Amy Berman puts it this way: people don't have the facts, democracy doesn't work. And historian Timothy Snyder says, when we give up trying to establish and verify facts, tyranny will certainly follow. So not putting too fine a point on it, we're talking about what motivated us to work on this book was the understanding that if our students are not better able to recognize and fight information pollution and fake news, that it's going to have really negative effects on their personal lives and on our democratic lives as a society.
This is Hans Rosling from the book Factfulness, which I highly recommend to anyone who's depressed about the state of the world. He argues that things are way better than we think, and we have the tools to make things even better yet. He says a fact-based worldview is more useful for navigating life, just like an accurate GPS is more useful for finding your way in the city. As Michael has just said, if you're going to have intelligent voters, if you're going to have smart public policy, and if you want to be your best, most ethical, most practical, most useful self, you have to have a fact-based worldview. If you're governed by information pollution, it's going to be personally damaging, socially damaging, and culturally damaging. I'm a very passionate Nordic skier. I know some of you who I saw in the chat know this. And my coach is a famous Paralympian, one-arm Willie Stewart. And every time we have practice, he says, today, are you going to get better or are you going to get worse? And the point he's making is that when we're dealing with complex problems or other issues that require a heavy lift, that there's only one way to get better. And that's to pay attention and deliberately and mindfully practice to improve. And if you don't, you're entrenching all your bad habits. And we have a lot of bad cognitive habits. It's true of everybody. We're all susceptible to information pollution, and understanding that and dealing with it is part of our approach.
And the reason that that's so important is that we mentioned the proliferation of fake news. So a case in point, of course, was Alex Jones, who seemingly thought that it was okay to tell lies about the horror of the Sandy Hook shootings. I mean, terrible things. We worry that TikTok, it's not just Alex Jones though, is that with the growth of new technologies, fake news is becoming increasingly sophisticated. That's what this headline from the New York Times said about manipulated video and photos on TikTok. So much so, and one of the funny things about the book was that as we were writing the book, every time we wrote in an example, the next day in the news, there would be something that was worse, a worse case. So when we were just going into production, we read about, I'm sure you've seen it on America's Got Talent, that artificial intelligence actually competed as a contestant. And here you see Simon being represented through artificial intelligence. So the sophistication and the prevalence of highly sophisticated fake news is just increasing. So we need to get to work.
Here's another piece of news. This is from the News Literacy Project. And by the way, we are not trying to reinvent wheels that have already been invented. So we highly recommend that you subscribe to the News Literacy Project, who does such great work, to the Stanford History Education Group, SHAG, who does such great work. We're going to talk today about what we're doing, which is unique. But the News Literacy Project, it's got great resources, and we love them. A few weeks ago, they published this. Americans spread widespread concerns about the spread of misinformation, with 91% of adults saying it's a problem, according to a new poll. Across the political spectrum, Democrats, 80%, and Republicans, 70%, also agree that misinformation increases political extremism. Now, this is bipartisan agreement. It doesn't matter where you are on the spectrum. We're in agreement about this. Many Americans report taking steps to avoid misinformation or curb its spread, from deciding not to share content on social media to checking multiple sources or using fact-checking websites and tools. And then the News Literacy Project, whenever they cite a problem, they give you tools for addressing it. So what can we do? Here's the uniqueness of our approach. We argue the answer is instruction, that all solutions to all problems require instruction and deliberate practice with the tools for addressing that problem. In this case, with information pollution, including instruction and practice support self-study of our own minds, our own biases, our own susceptibilities, because we have a lot of them. And if we don't become aware of them, we can't control for them. And instruction and practice to develop students' capacity for identifying and interrogating information pollution and developing thoughtful and defensible claims based on evaluated credible evidence.
So a quick question, Megan, our participants are going to get the slideshow. They're going to get links to the slides.
Yes, and the recording.
Yes,
And the
yes, that will
recording.
be sent out via email.
Okay. So given the problems, given that people are so concerned with fake news, many educators, parents are arguing for instruction to help students fight fake news. Matter of fact, New Jersey just passed the first media literacy requirement, a law that said that they're going to develop state standards for media literacy, first of its kind in the nation, and other states are sure to follow. But one of our concerns is that most of the calls for fighting fake news, for increasing attention to these issues, are problematic for a couple of reasons. One is that they don't fully recognize how readers themselves are implicated in fake news. How because of my, as Jeff said, are the cognitive biases that we all share, that I'm partly to blame for being victimized by fake news. So they don't recognize that. I think that it's easy to say, and I'm hoping that you share this view, it's easy to say, well, let's just add that to the curriculum without recognizing how busy we already are as teachers. So if we're going to do this work, we have to be able to make connections with what we're already doing. I think that we also have to recognize the extent to which existing educational and assessment practices promulgate a kind of teachings that it's at odds with what we're going to be suggesting in this webinar today. So the idea of one right answer instead of problematizing answers that you see in the first slide. And I think we also have to recognize that it's a difficult political time. And whatever approach we take to fighting fake news, we have to understand that we need to feel safe to teach it in politically charged times. So that's the political headline. So the culture wars in schools are worse than ever. So we need to be an approach to fighting fake news needs to be mindful of that political reality.
All right, we're going to let you think about this and respond for 1 minute. It's not enough time, so good luck. Just choose one prompt. What was your biggest surprise from the section? I used to think blank, but now I think blank. How would you share a central takeaway so far, insight with others? Or I'm now committed to rethink something. And if you're willing to type your takeaway into the chat box, that's awesome. If you're with someone, you can just tell them what you think. 1 minute, make it so. All right, I'm seeing some responses. 25 more seconds, full court press. Of course, you can keep typing and when we start talking again. Thanks everyone for playing. All right, so let's get after this susceptibility that we all have. This is a really important starting point to know your own mind, or you're going to be manipulated. When I grew up in rural Ohio, I lived near a county highway, and they used to have these Burma shave signs. If you're my age, you might remember this. So the first sign said, "Don't lose," and then you drove 25 yards, and it said, "Your head to gain a minute. You need your head. Your brains are in it." And then the last schilt would say Burma shave or use Burma shave. I'm sure they took these away because they caused car crashes or whatever. But I tell my students, you have lost your head 95% of the time. You are not thinking. There's that old joke about adolescents. Whenever you ask, what were they thinking? The answer is they weren't. Well, in fact, this is true. Daniel Kahneman's research shows that 95% of the time, we use what he calls system one, which is intuition and instinct, this fast, automatic, heuristic, associative, unconscious, and highly error-prone and bias-prone kind of automatic thinking. Now, Kahneman says if you're going to deal with a complex problem like information pollution, you need to activate system two, this rational thought, which is slow, which is effortful, which is logical, which requires conscious attention, and which is highly reliable. One of the things Kahneman says is that system two is notoriously lazy and would love for system one to do all its work. This is a challenge in school because you can't deal with information pollution or any new kind of learning unless you activate system two, which takes a lot of effort. When you look at the research on why we all believe in spread information pollution, it basically goes back to system one. We have cognitive and memory limitations. We have many cognitive biases. We have pre-existing commitments, beliefs, and identities that cause what's called confirmation bias. We have directed motivations to depend or support our identity and group affiliations. Messages from other people who are close to us or influential on us are going to keep us in system one. And when we're anxious about a situation and there's high stakes information, even if it's totally polluted, if it matters to us, we're likely to be manipulated by it. We all know how addictive social media and cell phones are. If you've read that recent MRI research coming out of Tufts University, they have found that when your cell phone dings or you open a social media post, the same part of your brain lights up as the part for a heroin addict when they take a hit. And I'm just here to say that research shows that if kids have cell phones in school, they will not be learning. They are going to be totally and utterly distracted. So that's just one takeaway. Now, the power of untruthful information pollution is in part because we're literally programmed evolutionarily to believe everything we see and hear. If you went into a new situation and you saw a grizzly bear, there was no time for lateral reading or to verify that it was a grizzly bear. You had to run. Likewise, if you saw food, there was no chance to say, well, is it the thing I really want to eat? You grabbed the food, you grabbed the fish. Kahneman says we have a primordial brain trying to operate in a modern world. To survive, our brains believe whatever they see and hear, even if it's on social media, even if it is pure information pollution. Here's an example of availability bias, which is one of three biases we take on in the book and give a lot of activities around. And we suggest that you embed these activities in whatever instruction that you're doing. This is from a unit I teach on how do we prepare for the next disaster. And so I would give the kids many of these. Here's just one. How many people die each year in commercial airplane crashes in the United States? So you can think yourself, what do you think the answer is? How many people die each year in automobile crashes each year in the United States? Well, it turns out that since 2003, so for the last 20 years, it's been fewer than one person a year who has died in large commercial airplane crashes in the United States. If you think about small commercial planes like 6 to 8 seaters, it's more like 15 a year. But it's over 40,000 a year of people who die in automobile crashes. So why is it that we think that airplanes are so much more dangerous than cars? This is called availability bias. What we use is what's most recent, most frequent, most personal, most emotional, most triggering. And among all the available information in the world, we focus only on that which is most recent, frequent, personal, triggering, emotional. Confirmation bias is another bias that we take on in the book. And it's a very similar idea that what you see among the whole universe of objective facts is only what confirms your belief. I love this cartoon. Did you read my paper on confirmation bias? Yes, but it only proved what I already knew. So this is a problem for all human beings, ourselves and all of our students. Just think of an example of confirmation bias from your own life. I guarantee you've had several of these today. Not seeking out objective facts, interpreting information to support only your existing belief, only remembering details that uphold your belief, ignoring information that challenges your belief. You know, Michael talked about school practices that undermine our approach. Here's one, the 5-paragraph essay. It doesn't fit how we argue in the real world or how experts argue. It doesn't require you to evaluate evidence because we just take evidence from books and you just say it was in the book. We know from studies of kids what they do is they start with a claim and then they cherry pick evidence that fits their claim and they ignore other evidence. In the real world, if you're a researcher, if you're a social scientist, if you're an expert in any domain, you look at patterns of evidence first, and that generates your claim. The way we assess, the way we teach argument, it all works against controlling information pollution. I have my students generate their own images about bias. Here's one I like. Ever since you told me about confirmation bias, I'm seeing it everywhere. You're confirming confirmation bias. That's exactly how it works. One of the tools I like to use is All Sides. They have a great website, and you can go to it and you can see where your news source lies in terms of bias. I was shocked to find out that CNN, where I get almost all of my news, is left-leaning. It's not just leaning left, it's left. I couldn't believe it. That means if I read something on CNN, it's only responsible to look at other sources with other kinds of leans. Now, when my students do work for school, I say, go find the bias of your source. Every source is biased. All Sides also shows the bias of specific articles and specific authors. So it's a very, very powerful thing for them to do, to test. Am I only reading stuff that comes from my own confirmation bias, or am I looking across the spectrum? Here's another set of biases that we take on in the book. They're called, well, I won't tell you what they're called for a moment. True or false? Tigers eat people. True or false? Mosquitoes transmit the West Nile virus. What do you think? Well, this is one of the examples of the over-dramatization biases. It's called the gapped instinct, that we only see extremes and we see the world in binaries. This is also called the binary bias, when in fact, reality exists on a circular continuum. Tigers eat people. Yeah, that's true, but it's the very, very rare tiger and only a very weak tiger who might eat a human. Mosquitoes do transmit the West Nile virus, but according to the NIH, only 2 to 20% of mosquitoes are carriers in areas where there is West Nile, and only 0.0002% of people bitten by a carrier have the disease transmitted to them. I don't even know how to do the math to think how rare it would be to get bit by a mosquito and have it turn into West Nile. And yet we think in these either or binaries. Gun control is a great example that it's assumed that either you're totally for gun control or totally against gun control. In fact, research shows that over 76% of all Americans favor a middle ground of some kind of gun control. When we only see the binaries, we don't see the whole picture, and we don't see possibilities that could help us address our problems. Now, it's really important to have the context of guided inquiry when we do our work with kids. There's many reasons for that. One is the most powerful way to teach and learn. But another, in our case here, is that it looks at all perspectives and interrogates our own biases and perspectives. Zeynep Tufekci is very famous for saying, when we must decide between believing the facts or belonging, belonging always wins. It's a kind of confirmation bias. How do we fight that? We have to do what John Milton wrote about in Areopagitica. Truth was never bested by a bad argument unless all the arguments were not made. If I'm right and you're wrong, I should want to correct you. If I'm wrong and you're right, I should want to be corrected. But if this is most likely you're kind of right and I'm kind of right, we need to converse. We need to look at all the perspectives to get a more truth-based and factful point of view. In inquiry, that's what you do. We propose using this model of Empower. It's basically the model behind any inquiry or guided inquiry approach. So if you use Systems Connect or project-based learning or integrated inquiry, which is used in IB schools, or understanding by design with Wiggins and McTide, if you teach multilinguals and they do vested or SIOP, if you use Project Zero's teaching for understanding, it doesn't matter. The underlying architecture is Empower, where you envision a destination for your students, because you can't get anywhere unless you know where it is you're trying to go. If you don't map by saying, this is where my students are, the various places there are, and this is the mental model and the path they have to take to mastery, that's offstage. That's you as a teacher figuring things out about what to teach, how to teach, what sequence to teach. The power is what you do with the kids. So you prime them by activating what they already know and already care about. The great mentor of both Michael and myself, George Hillocks, was fond of saying, the only resource you have to teach a kid something new is what they already know and already care about. And it could be that what they know is wrong. You're not going to be able to correct it, as in the case of information pollution, unless you activate it and interrogate it. Then you have to orient them. They have to understand the purpose and payoff to them right now, today, as well as in the future. The walkthrough is the actual apprenticeship, where you are assisting the kids through the provision of new strategies, through deliberate practice, by giving them new tools to become smarter, to do what they can't yet do alone. Then we engage and extend. We rehearse for transfer. We try it out in our own reading. We try it out with our own mini inquiries. And throughout, you're reflecting. Now, one of the great things about Empower is that it captures research from across the learning sciences: motivation, optimal experience, effective teaching. And here's just one example. Anders Ericsson's 6 elements of deliberate practice. Clear and specific goals, that's envisioning and mapping. Preparation for success, that's priming and orienting. Focused, deliberate practice, that's the walkthrough and extension. Pushing beyond your comfort zone, that's the walkthrough and extension. Receiving high quality feedback, which is called procedural feedback, or developing a mental model of the expert task. That's both reflective. Now, every step is essential. If we don't envision, the instruction's aimless. If we don't map, kids can be overwhelmed, and we might be overwhelmed too. If we don't prime, kids are disconnected. If we don't orient, they will be unmotivated. If we don't walk them through new skills and strategies, they'll remain at the same skill level. If they don't extend and explore, they'll remain unchallenged, and they won't transfer what they have learned. And if we don't reflect throughout, then they will remain dependent instead of become independent. Something we know from the research going back to the 50s on schema theory is that expertise must be built in a context of use. Natalie Wexler has made this kind of popular recently, but the research goes back 70 years, that you can only learn new processes of critical literacy, reading, math, science, whatever, in the context of the content. You can't think historically unless you know historical content. You can't think mathematically unless you're learning math. And the language we use as we do this builds a sense of conscious competence and expertise that allows us to transfer what we've learned. So it's very important that you teach information pollution and everything else that's important to you in the context of the stuff you already have to teach about reading, about writing, about English, about math, about science. That's the only way it's going to work. And information pollution is rife in science. Math is used to misportray evidence. In English, unreliable narratives. I mean, I could go on and on. Now, Anders Ericsson, you know this guy, even if you don't know his name, because Malcolm Gladwell made him famous with the 10,000 hours of practice to become an expert. Ericsson's really the world's expert on expertise, which is a cool title. I wish I had that title. And he boils down his 50 years of research on expertise to these two things. If you're an expert, you have a mental model, a highly conscious and articulated representation of a task and how to complete it. Empower is a mental model for planning and implementing teaching. But we need to teach mental models of how to deal with information pollution. And you need deliberate practice, which he calls mindful, focused practice aligned with the correspondence concept. Ericsson's very fond of saying you could practice 10,000 hours and still suck. You need to practice what experts practice and how they practice with their mental model. And what you're learning has to correspond to expertise. That's what the correspondence concept is. Practice does not make perfect, it makes permanent. So we better be darn careful what we practice and how we practice it. And we must deliberately practice in ways that lead us towards expertise and that meet the correspondence concept. Let's take a moment. What is one thing you think you could do to help students recognize and control for their availability, confirmation, or over-dramatization biases? Just take a minute. It's not enough time, but we're under pressure here. So think about it. Talk to a neighbor if you're with somebody. If not, please chat in an idea in the chat. Thank you so much. 1 minute. Thanks so much to everybody who's typing in their ideas. That's awesome. I saw a question about, are we teaching what or how? We're totally teaching the how. We're trying to give the kids these protocols, these mental models that they can apply to any time they're reading social media or reading any kind of text or judging or evaluating evidence or whatever. So we're totally about the how, because we think if the kids understand the hows, they're going to be able to learn the what on their own. So it's the why and the how we focus on in our approach. Wow, thank you so much to everybody who's typing in. I so appreciate it. Michael, over to you.
Okay, so at the beginning of the presentation, we talked about some issues that we thought affected most calls to fight fake news. One was the one that Jeff talked about, that is that a lot of approaches to fake news do not delve into and engage students in understanding the extent to which we're all implicated in our own victimization by fake news. What we're going to talk about now is we're going to talk about the other three concerns that we have. One is that most approaches, we can't just add on a whole new domain that we didn't have. We have, because we're already so busy. So we have to figure out ways to build bridges between what we're already doing and the fighting of fake news on interrogating information pollution. But what we've heard on more than one occasion is a statement like the one that's in the question here. Well, I already teach critical reading in literature or in historical texts. Won't that suffice? And the answer is a hard no, because readers' text and context are profoundly different in the digital domain. So the work that we do with linear text, not yet, the work that we do with linear texts resembles, but does not map on exactly to what we're doing in the digital domain. So readers in a digital domain act in author-like. Do I click this link? Do I play this video? So I'm not only reading, I'm acting as an author. What makes the text? So the text in linear text, we all read the same text. In the digital domain, we read different text because we might choose to follow different links at different times. The contexts are different because one of the characteristics of the world that we're living in is the tremendous agglomeration of information that we have. And we know that because of what Jeff was saying with confirmation bias, we know that what happens is that there are algorithms on the internet that feed us stuff that confirms what we already believe, so that we are reading in context where we're reading in context where we're given lots of other texts create us around. We're not reading things separately as much as we used to. So that means that we have to think about ways to build bridges between more conventional, traditional texts as opposed to the digital text. And so one of the things that I think we're all called upon to do as teachers across domains is to teach close reading. And one of the characteristic of close reading is you can't pay attention to every detail in a text with the equal amount of attention you'd never get through a book or story or even a page. So what we know as experienced readers is that we attend to some details more than others. So what I want to do is I sort of want to illustrate this point by looking at a famous painting, American Gothic by Grant Wood. I want you to think for a minute. I want you to look at this, if you can, with fresh eyes, and tell me what you notice, what you think Grant Wood wants us to pay most attention to. Let's just think for a few seconds about what Grant Wood wants us to notice and what he does to make us notice that. So let's think for a minute. 30 seconds. But what do you notice when you look at American Gothic, and why do you notice it? So let's type in some answers in the chat when you have them.
Boy, one thing I'd say, Michael, is that pitchfork. And the reason I know to notice it is it's front and center.
So we notice we're supposed to pay attention. We know that we're supposed to pay attention to the stuff that's in front. That would be a kind of a call to attention. Okay,
it's kind of symbolic valence because the devil carries a pitchfork around.
All right.
It's repeated because it's in his overalls, and you kind of got a variation on it on the church window in the dormer.
And so the difference in their dress we notice because it doesn't seem to fit. Usually when people get portraits, they're wearing the same kind of clothes. Okay, their eyes are, in a portrait, usually people are looking at us instead of looking sideways. She's looking to where their gazes are. So there are a lot of things that we tend to notice as when we look quickly at this. And so we think, in fact, that there are 4 fundamental rules of notice. One is what we have here is how Jeff and I named them is on the thing on the side to the left, and how our students named them on the side to the right. So calls to attention are things like the pitchforks right in the center. And the kids call them attention grabbers. Ruptures, or what we call ruptures, they call twists. So that's the fact that they're not looking straight ahead. That usually in a portrait, you're not so angry looking as they are.
Hey, another one, Michael, is that she's standing behind him. In a double portrait, you're supposed to get equal treatment.
A direct statement, the direct statement in a painting titled American Gothic is that says something about, we need to think about what Wood is saying about American Gothic. So that's the title, is a direct statement. And then I think we had a variety of reader response, what our kids called the vibe. How do you respond to this? What about it? So I always feel a bit concerned about the relationship right, what Sylvia just wrote in the chat, that she seems less important. And I wonder about that. That makes me a little bit angry, or worried about the sexism that he's trying to portray. So, or the seriousness of it. So all of those issues have to do with, or those emotional responses have to do with the reader response. So if we think about the rules of notice, we apply those when we read conventional literary texts. So let's take a look at one. It's one of my favorite poems. It's called Those Winter Sundays. And what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to read this. And as I'm reading, I want you to pick out what you think is the most important word or phrase, and then think about what Robert Hayden did to make you recognize the importance of that word or phrase. So here we go. Sundays too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather made bank fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? Most important word or phrase? When you're ready, type it in the chat.
And how do you know to notice it?
And how do you know to notice it? So what we're seeing is the operation of these. Jeff, what did you pick?
Do you know, I picked the last two lines. What did I know? What did I know? Because it's a repetition. It's almost like a lament of love's austere and lonely offices. And that seems like a rupture to me, because we have these everyday activities. You know, the father gets up, he builds a fire, he polishes the shoes. But it turns out it's this very high and noble thing of love's austere and lonely offices. So, and of course, it's the ending. So it's a privileged position, which is a call to attention.
So mine would be two, the word two in the first line. And I noticed that because it seems like I know Sundays I don't get up early, so that the two is kind of a rupture. It's unusual. So we have ruptures. We have, if you read the things and we see blue, black, cold, it seems brutal. That's the reader response. No one ever thanked him. That's the most explicit, direct statement. We have all of these images, and then we have the explicit statement, no one ever thanked him, and we have the what did I know, what did I know, the repetition. The repetition of the sounds is a call to attention. So the kinds of things that we do in close reading of a poem is the same kind of things that similar kinds of things that we did in close reading when we did the American Gothic. And what the book talks about is helping students do a kind of close reading of the images, the digital images that they're encountering. So let's take a look at one. So since we were talking about fathers, we're going to look at, this is from a website called fatherly.com. So I want you to look at this picture and see, what do you notice and why do you notice it? Do the same thing. Let's think for a minute of what do you notice? Why do you notice it?
You know, Michael, I didn't think about this before, but I'm noticing how hip and healthy and active these guys are, but there's no kids anywhere. It's like an omission.
Sense of women and children is certainly an omission. Is certainly an omission. It's certainly a rupture,
Particularly on a website that's devoted to fatherhood.
So one of the things that I notice is the rupture with this. I'm noticing the different ages, and this father is much older than some of the other fathers. So in this image, we notice things. We're being conditioned to think about fatherhood in particular kinds of ways. And a question might be, why do you do that? So let's look at the next slide and see if we can figure out. Here's what followed on the landing page. There was an article about the best damn sneakers to wear with the best damn jeans. What do you see as the relationship between what do the images do to prepare the readers for this story? Let's think for a minute. What do you think the creators of this website are trying to do with the people who look first at that set of images and then follow with this story? So you see, if you look at what's happening in the chat, we're seeing that there's a commercial dimension to this. So it's what we noticed in the image is casting readers as consumers of particular or active in a particular kind of way, so they can be consumers in particular kinds of ways. So we could go on, but the idea is that these texts are different kinds of texts, but the work that we do resembles it, and we've got to build bridges when we teach close reading of literary texts to imagistic text to digital text, and as we'll see as we're going on, that have a explicitly commercial dimension. So let's take a look at another kind of thing that we do as teachers all the time, where we can build bridges between what we do already and fighting fake news.
Hey, Michael, this is making me think of your work on authorial reading, that any text is written by someone or some people who are trying to manipulate us into knowing, believing, or doing something in some way. And we better ask, who's that person? How are they positioned? How are they positioning us? And do I want to go along? Because I might have been attracted to this fatherly until I realize how they're positioning me and how they want to manipulate me.
And that's one of the something that we do in English classes that gets at that even more is this idea of teaching point of view. Now, conventionally, when you teach point of view, what kids are asked to do is identify the point of view instead of once you recognize the point of view, to figure out what that means for how your understanding is going to be affected. So in literature, the point of view is meant to be understood. So even in ironic literature, we're meant to get the irony. If you don't get the irony, you're a victim of the irony. But in the digital text, it's sometimes meant to deceive. We know the source of information in a literary text, but in a digital text, we might not. So if a writer is writing something on a website that's sponsored by an organization, so who do we have to understand? Who's the source of information there? We talked about the commercial dimension in literature is not so important, but as we just saw, it's really important in the digital domain. You probably know the metaphor of mirrors and windows. So literature, sometimes we see ourselves and sometimes we see others, but because of the confirmation point that Jeff was making, we typically see mirrors just in digital texts. And all of this means that in point of view, it's within texts, the determining reliability in a digital domain requires the kind of lateral reading, which the fact checkers do. So let's look quickly at a text. We're just going to look at one.
Hey, Michael, I just like to make a comment about the mirrors, because most of the social media text and the links that come to me and to you, it wasn't me finding them. It was them finding me. And one of the things we know from research is that the algorithms work to make you more extreme. So if you type in some about vegetarianism, you'll start getting links coming your way about veganism. So it's a very, very dangerous and nefarious thing. The other day, I bought my wife some fluffy pajamas for Valentine's Day. And she walks by me and I'm reading CNN and she goes, "What are you reading?" And I go, "What do you mean?" Well, there was pictures of lingerie along the top, advertisements. And she goes, what's going on? And I go, I don't know. Well, then I thought, oh my God, they took the fluffy pajamas that I ordered and now they're sending me lingerie ads. This is how social media works and the algorithms work to mirror our confirmation bias and make us more extreme. So that's just a recent example that happened to me yesterday.
So one of the things we do is we use a sort of conventional print text to get students to understand point of view, but we're running out of time. So I'm just going to show a video, which is the object of one of the lessons. So let's look at, I want you to think about the point. We're going to see a news story about a conflict that a student had with a teacher. And I want you to think about the point of view
a YouTube video of Duncanville High School student giving his history teacher a lesson has gone viral and tonight has his district talking.
If you would just get up and teach them instead of handing them a freaking packet, There's kids in here who don't learn like that. They need to learn face to face. You want kids to come into your class, you want them to get excited for this, you got to come in here, you got to make them excited. You want a kid to change and start doing better, you got to touch his freaking heart. Can't expect a kid to change if all you do is just tell him.
Well, that video was posted this afternoon on our Facebook page, and Channel 8's Jason Whiteley tracked down that young man for us tonight. Jason?
I had dropped out for...
Jeff Bliss says he has no regrets.
No, not at all. I believe that somebody needed to say this. Get up and teach them.
What he told his teacher in his world history class on Monday has now been seen around the world, gone viral.
I want to see a teacher stand up and interact with the students, get involved, discuss, talk, question, and get deep into the subject.
The 90-second video begins after the teacher at Duncanville High School kicks him out of her class. Bliss told us he initially questioned why students did not have more time to prepare for the STAR test, but then he unloads on her style, critical of her passing out worksheets rather than creating lively and engaging discussions in the classroom.
You want them to get excited for this? You got to come in here. You got to make them excited. You want a kid to change and start doing better? You got to touch his freaking heart.
Jeff's mother is a teacher, but the 18-year-old tells us he really discovered the value of education.
We can stop, Jeff.
School for a year.
And this is part of a lesson in which we ask students to, it's about a viral video that, as James just wrote in the chat, the student is in his 20s, but there is, when I did a search for this, there was a recent YouTube that talked about Jeff Bliss looking back at his 18-year-old self. But think about for a minute, how does the newscaster, how does the news report want us to feel about Jeff Bliss? And are there other possible ways to feel about him? So I would argue the answer to that, and what the activity gets kids to talk about, yeah, the teacher's point of view is completely absent. Okay, so they don't dwell on the fact that his dropping out of school is used as evidence to support his claim, as opposed to a critique of the way he was as a student. So we see, right, his district. So they're using him, they're casting him as an authority. His district takes notice. Absolutely set up. So they want us to value the student's point of view when there are other things clearly available. Now, the point is, viral videos, one of the things that's so interesting, videos can be shared. I mean, if you're in a school, you know, they're watching the same stuff. And we want them to understand what's happening, how those videos are constructed, so that they recognize the point of view and what the agenda of the makers of the video, as Jeff explained. So another way of doing this is to talk about literary lenses, and we have a chapter about that. So the gender lens, which used to be called the feminist lens, but we wanted to sell the books in Florida, so we can't call it that anymore. Or the social class lens, or the power lens. So the activities in one of our chapters talk about helping students put these lenses on as a way to think about what they read. So let's look quickly at an ad. So this is a Nike ad, my legs were once two hairy sticks. If you put on the gender lens, you're going to think about this ad in particular kinds of ways. But if you put on the social class lens, you're going to notice the commercial dimension. So the idea is that having kids be active readers where they are understanding the way that they are positioning themselves and recognizing how different theoretical lenses, help them see different things so that they can evaluate that and have sort of a toolkit of lenses that they can put on.
You know, a simple way we do this too, Michael, in the book is just to say to the kids, once they've stated a position, what if you were an African-American from the 19th century?
Yes.
Or what if you were an immigrant today? And just show them that there are other points of view and other positions from which to view the text or the material.
So the last section of the book, we talk most explicitly about writing. And we talk about argumentative writing. And remember, we said one of the things that we worry about is that there are practices that we have that we think sort of interfere with our goal of fighting fake news. Well, one of them is that in interpretive text-based, in the world of the internet, establishing evidence as a solid foundation on which to build is critically important. So I'm thinking about retirement. Jeff says to me, you should retire to Boise. And I say, what makes you say so? He says, it's a great place to live. Well, that's not a solid foundation, because I would say, what makes you say so? But if he says it's high desert, I've got to grant that. And then he has to explain to me why it's true. But in text-based arguments, you don't have to establish your evidence because the evidence is the text. We say as long as it has textual evidence, cite the text. Where's the textual evidence? But we don't do as much work in helping our students recognize what provides a solid foundation. So in this chapter, next slide, please.
You know, Michael, I just want to point out that these semantic scales we use in the book, the kids can develop these as they rank and evaluate evidence. And then the semantic scales, which they can use in their reading and their justification of evaluating evidence, that's a mental model of what makes good evidence.
And we'll go to the next slide. So how many times have you heard, well, I've done my research. I researched on the internet. And what we want to do with our students is to create a series of activities that will help them scrutinize, that help them think hard and critically about the research that they see on the internet. So we help them develop 5 questions. Who's doing the study? Who are the participants? What causes what? What instruments are used? Can I reason from a single story? Who's doing the study? Is there a bias? Who are the participants? Are the people who are involved in the study, to what extent are they representative? We know, for example, that ice cream eating and murders go up in the summer. Does ice cream eating cause murders? So that have students critically analyze cause and effect. Biased questions in a questionnaire. And then we often reason from a single story, and sometimes we ought to do it, but if students reason from a single story, we want them to be conscious of it. And so we do some work with memes. Let's look at one. Or I'm sorry, this is an Instagram post. So if this is for a shampoo, and what we would want students in the lesson, what we want students to notice is we asked our Hair Life squad what they thought of Nutrient Plus shampoo. 100% said it aided in hair growth. Well, that's because it's your squad. So that 100% doesn't do much good. So as we're coming to a close here, what we're doing is we're thinking about doing work that we need to do in our regular teaching, but extending that, recognizing that digital text and the digital domain works differently. And so building bridges so that students can, in just words, apply the mental model that they've developed in one kind of reading to another kind of reading, and one kind of writing to another kind of writing.
Thanks, Michael. I'd have you think about how are you going to apply some of what you've learned here? What's a strategy you could use in a specific lesson or unit, or a way you can invite students to be reflective about their biases and their positioning? Are there some commitments that you're taking on or rethinking? I want to close by just mentioning about artificial intelligence, Chat GPT, which of course is a very big deal in schools now. I asked some students about it the first week of December, and they said to me, can we speak off the record? And they were already using it to do assignments. Now, the jury's still out about, are there going to be positives? But we know there's going to be a lot of negatives. One of the things that really bothers me about this is that if kids are farming out their writing to a chatbot, they are losing the joy, the power, the learning that comes from figuring out what they think and how they can justify what they're thinking. They're going to miss out on all of that. Here's my big worry about all AI. If you look at AI designers and how they talk about the different things like DALL-E and Metaphysic Media and ChatGPT, they all say there's no truth or accuracy metric. What these things are doing is gleaning patterns from the dross of the internet. What could possibly go wrong with that? So we're going to get lots and lots of fake news that sounds good that was generated by chatbots. Again, going back to Michael's point with authorial reading, every text is meant to manipulate you into knowing, believing, feeling, or doing something. It's like when you listen to a joke that might be racist or sexist, you're being asked to endorse that point of view. You have to be able to go, wait a minute. I don't think that's funny. I have a different point of view. You better always be asking, who wrote this? How are they positioned and positioning me? What do they want me to know, believe, or do?
So what we're asking you to do is, in closing, is that it's important that we take this on. The students' personal lives and the fate of our democracy really, to some extent, depends on it. We stress that if we're going to do this work, you have to start by helping students understand the extent to which their biases are implicated in fake news. And then we have to build teaching the how and build bridges between what we're already doing and what we need to do in the future. And we hope that then our students will become better equipped and more willing to fight fake news on their own.
The guided inquiry work comes from two books that I wrote in the middle of COVID, Planning Powerful Instruction, grades 6 through 12 and 2 through 5. It's now 30% off. Valentine's Day is tomorrow. Maybe you get somebody who would enjoy it. Christmas isn't that far away. And I'm going to turn it over to Megan for the announcement of the winners.
Goodbye.
Thanks so much to everybody.
Thanks, everybody.